sometimes it's better for me to just sit back, bite my tongue, and then in 4 years I'll be able to say what I want.
There has been a gradual institutionalization of this code of conduct, the effect of which is to prevent people from ventilating their views. Bright students won't put up with it.
Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith.
They stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber at Yale.
We disagree, we debate, and then at the end of the day, we remain friends.
Welcome back, everyone, to Pod and Man at Yale after a nice winter break. I'm your host, Ari Schaefer, the Buckley Institute's Director of Communications. Please subscribe to Pod and Man at Yale on the App Store, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Today, we'll be asking a panel of students why go to college at all, and talking to an expert on how to live the good life. So in true Buckley fashion, let's get right to it.
Join us on Thursday, May 9th in New York City for this year's Disinvitation Dinner featuring world-renowned author and thinker Ayaan Hirsi Ali. A research fellow at the Hoover Institution, Ali was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people. She will be sharing her defense of the values free societies are based on, as well as her response to the forces seeking to undermine them. Sponsorships are available at buckleyinstitute.com/disinvitation 2024. Tickets to come.
Welcome everyone to Pod and Man at Yale. We're doing a special episode today with our Lux at Veritas Leadership Fellows. It's a year-long program to develop a select group of students into courageous future leaders committed to advancing the principles of a free society. What this means for our listeners is we're having something of a round table with 5 guests rather than the usual 2 or 3. So first we'll go around the horn and do names. Just tell us where you're from and we'll dive right into the discussion.
For sure. My name's Isaac Oberman. I'm from South Central Wisconsin.
My name's Emma, and I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
I'm Will, and I'm from Houston, Texas.
I'm Claire, and I was born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona, but my new home is Lexington, Massachusetts.
I'm Sabrina Guo, and I'm from Long Island, New York.
Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. So today we're going to be talking why college. For a lot of us, I remember when I went to college, we did it part because you just wanted to get a good job after, right? Getting a salary, getting a good career, that was, honestly a big part of it. There's anyone who was just looking at college saying, I want to make sure I make 6 figures, maybe 7 figures afterwards?
Yeah, I think college is oftentimes given as a pathway to upward mobility for a lot of students, as a way to get out of their small hometowns if they grew up in rural areas like me, and to make a name for themselves and find their place in the world. That's what kind of college has been shown as in the high schools to students.
I came into college with very little knowledge of what I actually wanted to study, but I was always encouraged by my parents and my mentors to choose a path and to be okay with veering from that, be okay with looking at different topics, different fields. So college for me was definitely a way to explore more potential in myself and also things that I was interested in.
Yeah, I think a big part of, something that coming into Yale that I didn't really consider as much compared to before I came to Yale or before I applied to college is really the people. I considered it, but after really immersing myself in the environment, it struck me how important the people really are. And I know it's a cliche, but I think it's another thing that makes college especially valuable, because there are people coming in from across the country, all over the world, and you learn so much from immersing yourself in different communities and making friends with people from different backgrounds.
I did not have any pressure upon myself to choose a school, even when I was just looking around or doing standardized tests. So for me, it was really important to go into the process with an open mind and realize that I could be happy wherever I was placed and be willing to create the campus that I wanted and to be willing to find myself in certain groups that would develop me personally as well as academically. So I definitely took more of the idea that college is what I would make of it than that I had to be at a specific place.
So do you guys feel like you've gotten the experience you were looking for out of Yale so far in terms of your overall goals for going to college in the first place?
I would say yes. I think that the caliber of academics at Yale is definitely what it's made out to be, and I think that that's wonderful. I know that something else that we were going to talk about in this podcast are the sort of current events going on about colleges, right? the Israel-Palestine thing and the Penn and Harvard president resignations. But to me, that kind of stuff, it's important, but it's just in the context of what I care about most at college and what I came into it looking for, it's kind of just noise.
I think that's definitely has some truth to it in the sense that, for me, my personal experience on college campus has not been necessarily defined by the scandals, I guess you could call them, of the past 6 months or so, but really of the past, 10 years or so, ever since maybe at Yale, the situation with Silliman College Master Christakis, when that whole incident with the Halloween costumes took place. That hasn't necessarily defined my entire time at Yale, like living in the shadow of, a few events of some pretty, radical students doing things, right? The universities are so large and varied that you can find these pockets of friendship and camaraderie in them.
So, to that point, there are a lot of people, as I mentioned in the intro, who are looking on campuses and seeing some of the protests and some of the slogans that are being shouted. They look at, what happened with Harvard's president and Penn's president and go like, what are they even learning? What are they teaching on those campuses? Does that affect you from your day-to-day experience on campus?
I mean, it does bleed into the curriculum if that's what you're asking about. I took a class this last semester, and I don't want to say what it is because the professor was really nice and I don't want to blast them, but it was a class about feminism where we talked about anything but women. It was very woke, as they say. In fact, we had this one class where we were reading this piece about transgenderism, and the professor was like, okay, guys, let's act it out in front of the class. So I was up in front of the class talking about, I am a transgender, I am a monster. And I think that that's a way that the sort of like woke noise of the world has bled into the content in classes, but there still are a lot of classes that have really, really important and really good intellectual content. You just have to be mindful and you have to look for them.
I mean, it can be really easy for the media to portray a group of students as representing the entire population of a university, right? And to say that there are very extreme groups, such as, groups that would, support Hamas, for example, which I think most Americans and most college students would probably say is very radical, right? But that doesn't mean to say that that is inherent in every student in the university. Certainly not in every student in the university. In fact, I'd say at Yale there's much more kind of wide-ranging ideological belief systems than maybe at other schools or even in America broadly.
Following up on Claire's point, there's some really wonderful classes at Yale with professors who care more about the academic content rather than maybe current events or certain ideologies, and they're really conducive to personal growth as well as academic development. And I think that seeking out these pockets through friends that you trust and through professors and their mentorship is a really great opportunity that Yale has presented, and one that I do not think has faded in certain parts of the university.
So, Isaac, I want to pull you into this also. Do the politics show up in the classroom in your conversations with friends? And if they do show up in the classroom, is it just kind of like an annoying part of the experience that you just move on from, or does it color your own experience?
It oftentimes is just like a quick little blurb, a little punch at like Republicans. If like say you got a liberal professor, he's just gonna be like make a little joke about Trump, and you kind of just like kind of laugh along with it. It's just like whatever, just let's get to the actual material. And most of the times in class, when I'm in class, at least in my econ classes, I don't really see these issues like popping up. It's oftentimes in those. There's very specific professors that if you kind of avoid the types of classes they like teach, you never even like have to deal with it in the first place.
I want to move to another part of this discussion. So part of the Lux at Veritas Fellowship programs, you guys are sitting down and studying with Dr. Ben Storey, and the focus of his class, or the focus of his, seminar, is how to live a good life, and how do you choose a path that brings you to a good life. Do you feel like that's something that's discussed at Yale? I mean, this isn't like a shot at Yale. I don't think it's discussed on many campuses, but is that something that comes up in classes at Yale in particular?
I think the places where you're going to find most conversation about what it means to live a good life on Yale's campus is specifically in ancient philosophy classes, because we're studying texts in which Plato and Aristotle and other ancient philosophers of that nature are exploring that question. But I think in a lot of other classes on campus where we talk about the nature of the good, it's kind of just assumed that we're all talking about the same thing and that we all know what that means. So I think that the more contemporary conversations about what it means to live a good life at Yale are happening in extracurricular groups. I know I can say for sure that I have this conversation all the time with a lot of groups that I'm in, including like the Party of the Right and, the Buckley program also.
Yeah, I think that I agree with Claire on that. A lot of extracurricular groups dive into that. And I haven't taken any philosophy classes yet at Yale, but I'm sure they also dive into that as well. But I have taken some humanities courses and English courses. And I think that what does it mean to lead a good life? It's definitely something that I feel is assumed, and it's not really dived into much on like what is good and like how there's not much promotion of the understanding that a good life is unique to each individual student.
So Sabrina, you and Claire both said there's kind of like an assumption of what it is, like a good life is, in your classes. What do you think that the campus assumption of what a good life would be actually is?
I think that within the group of people that I associate with on campus, we tend to associate the good life with self-determination. Like, I determine my own path, I determine my own destiny. The end is what I make it, right? And I think that a lot of the people on campus who I don't tend to politically agree with, which frankly is most of the campus, believe that the good life is something that's kind of like handed to them, that it's something that's provided to them, that they have like a right to. And I think that that's a really interesting sort of theory to have about what the good life is.
To put it simply, I think a lot of Yale students envision the good life as what other people's good lives are. I see a lot of following around campus, a lot of people going after the same opportunities, the same classes, regardless of whether they want to or not, maybe even the same major, the same prestigious extracurricular activities. And I think that this leads to a spiral at some points. And a lot of first-year students, sophomores, people early in their Yale careers, oftentimes become very disillusioned by the Yale experience because of that, because they're not following the dreams that brought them there.
Yeah, I saw this meme someone showed me from like the Yale, I guess, like discussion boards. I don't know. I'm not on them personally, so I couldn't attest to it. But it was like this thing. It was like what my parents think college is like, and it's like one of those like communist memes with like everyone holding pitchforks and like wearing overalls. It's like what college is actually like, and it's like, oh, stop crying and go to your 10th like interview with like McKinsey and like some venture capital firm. So I wonder, as I guess that's more a question to you guys. Like, is that what Yale actually is like? Like, is that, to your point, like, is that what most Yale undergrads are thinking of when they're trying to make a successful experience out of their undergraduate 4 years?
I think that that's the initial attempt. I believe that that's what people first flock to because it's what the masses are doing on campus. And with time and maybe with friends that can guide them in the right directions, people can maybe make the switch over to the fact that their Yale career should be what they want it to be, not what other people are doing. And I think that allowing what one studies and what one pursues in free time is very valuable for this. So instead of doing the 10th interview with a company that maybe somebody does not want to work for, regardless of the industry, it's a good idea to really sit down and take the time to think about what you want.
There's definitely like an immortalization of the grind set and the idea that like if I'm not doing something, I'm not doing anything. And just like if you want to be successful, you need to go out there and pursue as many different opportunities as you can.
I agree. I just wanted to quickly comment on the pitchfork thing and say that perhaps my fellow panelists at the round table here wouldn't have had this experience with the pitchforks as much, but I definitely have. I used to direct the Yale Women's Center, which is one of the wokest places on campus. And I definitely feel like I got canceled quite a few times for specific things that I believed while working there, because the rest of the board insisted that the mission of the Yale Women's Center extended beyond promoting women on campus, that it had to be Marxist, it had to be exclusionary of any women's society on campus that promotes women's advancement in capitalist society. So the pitchfork mobs are real, but they are definitely avoidable.
Can you give us an example of something that you felt like turned the Women's Center against you?
I'm trying to think of things. I haven't necessarily gotten in any fights with them to their face, but I have heard them talking about me behind my back, which is kind of funny. Like, there was a comment that my friend told me the other day that she was in class and she heard people talking about me, and they were talking about how I'm the female Andrew Tate, and I was like, what?
Wow, I'm glad they're such allies.
That's wild. All right. So I do want to go back, having discussed this, go back to the original topic of the discussion. Before you guys came to college, when you guys putting your applications together, taking SATs, ACTs, what have you, were you thinking about the good life and how college fit into that?
I think in high school, a lot of the people at my high school, at least, did not think of good life in terms of intellectual ideas, but they had a general sense of what they knew they wanted to do and what was good and what was a good life. And I think college for me has given me tools to vocalize what I think about the good life instead of just having an inherent sense of knowledge. So the intellectual development that college provides has definitely provided me with a better sense of the inward knowledge of what a good life is.
I mean, being blunt here, if someone were, if your parents were to find out, oh, I spent my 4 years in college figuring out how to live a good life and how to be happy, they'd probably roll their eyes and go, that's exactly what's wrong with kids these days. They don't want to learn anything practical. But do you guys think that, maybe a couple more courses focused like the Ben Storey seminar is on how to live a good life and how to choose a good life might make you better people?
What use is knowledge if you don't have purpose? You need vision to know how to use and put a plan into action. So I think that it's very important knowledge to be able to say, this is what I want, this is my values, these are my virtues and that I want to live forward in my life. And the other part of college then is to figure out, okay, this is what you want to do, here's the ways you can do it. And that's figuring out your vocation, figuring out the different pathways and the groups you want to interact with. I think that you have to have both pieces of the pie to have the full picture of college.
All right, I guess that wraps it up. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Pod and Man at Yale. It's great talking to you all.
Thank you.
Now with that, let's get right to our interview with American Enterprise Institute Senior Fellow Ben Storey on Living the Good Life. I'm happy to welcome Dr. Ben Storey. Dr. Storey is a Senior Fellow in Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He's a Research Fellow at the Civitas Institute at the University of Texas at Austin, and a Tocqueville Scholar at Furman University. He's here speaking to the Buckley Institute's second cohort of Lux at Veritas Leadership Fellows. Thanks, Dr. Storey, for joining Pod and Man at Yale.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Pleasure. So you focus on how to live a good life and how to find the path that brings you to a good life. Most people would kind of look at that and go that's not a very practical field. What drew you to that in the first place?
Yeah, there's something unusual about having a person like me working at a public policy think tank. I got into this, but this is not, I didn't get into this by saying, I want to go work at a think tank. What will I specialize in? I could do foreign policy, I could do economics, I could do housing, or I could do the question of the good life.
Sure.
I got into this because when I was an undergraduate, I was a very confused young person who didn't know how to live and was aware that I was confused about how to live. And I found that books and teachers and conversations with good friends actually helped me with that question, actually helped me think it through better. And then I found that I could continue doing that in graduate school And then I was fortunate enough to get a faculty job at Furman University, where I taught for 17 years, and could continue doing that work there. And then my wife and I wrote a book, and we came to Washington on sabbatical because we'd been political science professors for 17 years in my case, and didn't actually have any firsthand contact with politics. We thought maybe maybe our professional competence would be improved by like going to like see the show from a ringside seat. And so we came up to AEI, and lo and behold, we found that this major research institution at the center of American intellectual life and policy debates was actually really interested in what we had to say.
You mentioned you came to DC as a political science professor, hoping to get a firsthand experience of DC politics. Did it increase your optimism about politics in America or destroy it totally, which is often the case?
I think it increased my optimism. I mean, everyone is, well, but that's a relative statement, right?
That's true. I didn't ask what the floor was.
Right. Yeah. And so, or let me put it this way: it's increased my hope. Optimism is as some sort of, I don't know, blanket judgment that things are likely to get better, and I don't have any blanket judgment that things are likely to get better. I think things are bad in American politics, and I think that there's lots of reasons to think that in the immediate future they're going to get worse. However, one thing that coming to DC has done, it's just introduced me to a lot of smart, serious people who want to do good work on behalf of their country. And many of them are very frustrated right now, but it's just heartening to remember how many normal, serious, excellent, patriotic, decent Americans there are out there, and how many of them are working toward the good in American life. And I think that's, I saw this in my home community in South Carolina. There were, I had lots of wonderful friends and neighbors, but that didn't factor much into my assessment of politics. Politics was a distant thing that I read about in newspapers, thought about as part of academic discourse. And those two arenas of discourse tend to be extremely depressing. Actually seeing what people who are working actively in political life are trying to do is, at least in some cases, refreshing, in the sense that it breaks your sense that there's a kind of systematic curse on the nation.
So not to make too, rough of a segue, but to pull back to the broader question that you brought, I gave you a hard time in the first question, perhaps, about the practicality of studying, how to live a good life, both, just general curiosity and, thinking of what my parents would say if I had gone to college to study how to, live a good life. But, the Buckley Institute, we did bring you here for a reason. This is a leadership program. We're training students to be courageous leaders. We thought what you had to say would be of value to them. Why do you think studying how to live a good life is worthwhile for college students?
Yeah, I think particularly for people like Buckley students. Buckley students, Yale students, more generally students at elite colleges, yet more generally than that, students who are getting good college educations all over the place are, and it's, I think, helpful for them to recognize this about themselves because it's not emphasized enough. They're a very fortunate slice of humanity, all considered. In other words, there are very few people over the course of human history that have the kind of possibilities and options that a modern American college student has. And so the course that we're doing here is a course about the question of the good life. And that's because people need their educations to help them decide which among their many options they would like to choose as their own.
Again, I'm not trying to give you a hard time, but my parents, always jump, what they would say come to mind. So I'll speak, I guess, on their behalf. Is this something that a Yale education can teach you, or is it something you can figure out on your own? Or is this something that you get in church or from a spiritual leader, something along those lines?
I think this is something that you can get in lots of different venues. I should certainly hope you'd be able to learn something about it at Yale. I think you're also right to point toward the religious guidance of a church or a synagogue or another religious gathering as something that might be important for this. But I think there's a lot that we need. I also think people just pick up their reflection on this. They pick it up from their gym teachers, their football coaches. They pick it up in all kinds of different places. But human beings are gifted with minds, and most of us would like to apply our minds to the questions of our own lives, which are, of course, the questions of the greatest practical import for us. And it turns out that people have thought systematically about the question of how to live. They've assessed things like the various kinds of goods that human beings are interested in, things such as wealth or honor, and the degrees to which such things can or cannot make us happy. Insofar as we want to make ourselves happy, we should avail ourselves of those resources. And a place like Yale or any other good college that thinks of itself as offering an education in the liberal arts, that is, an education in the arts that help one live well with freedom, really ought to. I should hope that such an institution would encourage students to devote time toward what they can learn with their minds about how they ought to live their lives.
So we only have, obviously, a limited amount of time with Dr. Storey, so I recommend all of our listeners to read his book, his most recent book, Why We Are Restless, for more. But I'm going to ask for kind of, I think for a lot of people this question is intimidating almost. The question of how do I spend my life? What if I choose the wrong thing? So how do you take that first step? What's the mindset you should have when approaching this question of how do I figure out how I live a good life?
I think a certain kind of naivete is really important here. One of the things that I've noticed strangely over the course of my time in the classroom has been that many students despair about the possibility of learning something that could help them live better lives. They despair about that possibility before they begin to ask the question. In other words, they assume that their minds that they can't know anything that would actually help them live well. And I think this is a kind of unearned skepticism. In other words, I think there's something that people who live in the modern world pick up as a kind of mental atmosphere that suggests to us that a lot of people have asked these questions before, that there's been no consensus on the subject, and that therefore you really shouldn't hope for anything out of your reason with respect to figuring out the question of how to live. I really don't think we should take that proposition for granted. I don't think we should assume it's true before we begin to investigate these questions for ourselves. And so, my first word of encouragement to people would be just give it a try. Take a shot at seeing if you can actually understand anything that helps you figure out how you want to live your life.
So here's kind of, I guess, a little bit of a curveball question. We've all met the person who, when there are some fellows who are like this, since they were born or since they were 2 years old, they wanted to be a lawyer. Since they were born, they wanted to be a doctor. Since they were born, they wanted to be, a professional baseball player, and they seem, pretty well on the path to getting there. But I think for the majority of people, they have no idea what they want. What I wanted to do when I was in high school was I didn't even know the job I have now existed. Is there something, I guess, an added value for those who don't know and have to struggle to figure it out?
Yeah, I think that's, I think, look, there are some people who, I knew a young woman when I was teaching at Furman who she was the child of a lawyer. She'd always wanted to be a lawyer. I suspect that now she has gone on to be a very good lawyer and is doing good work in the law. And there are lots of kinds of good work that people can do. I don't think all kinds of work are good, but I think there are lots of kinds of good work that people can do. And it was the good fortune or blessing of this young woman that this was like right in front of her. I think even for people who are given a path in life relatively easily, it's good to reflect on things so as to make their choices self-conscious. And for the rest of us, you are not haunted by the notion that maybe I just bumbled into whatever it is that I'm doing.
So to that point, over the summer, you wrote about an author in the 1500s, Michel de Montaigne, say that right? And he emphasized the art of conversation as a means towards intellectual progress. And so I definitely want to come back to that with regards to the campus conversation in general. But one of the things you talked about, or I guess cited from him, is that some of that conversation happens with authors and books. It's not necessarily direct face-to-face with other people. So for those who want to start this exploration of how to live a good life, who are the authors that they should be in conversation with?
Well, for people who want to begin that conversation, the author I always turn to first is Plato, and I turn to Plato because he asked these questions like the question of justice in the Republic, or the question of the good life as we're exploring it in the Gorgias, or the question of love in the Symposium or the Phaedrus. He asked these questions with a kind of immediacy that it's hard to encounter in later authors. That is, there's a phenomenon that's been called sedimentation, where people have been arguing about things for a long time. And so there's you read some later authors, they're kind of assuming a lot of baggage about what's been said about some of these questions. There's very little baggage in Plato. He just walks up to you and asks you the question, like, how do you want to live? And that immediacy is just priceless.
So I want to now turn to the campus life, and especially looking at the past few months on what campuses have been like since October 7th, Hamas terrorist attacks in Israel, the response, a lot of questions raised about what's taught on campuses. And I know universities don't often engage with this question of how to live a good life. It's not a core part of like the traditionally thought curriculum. Do you think not having this question as a central part of the syllabus has negatively impacted campuses and maybe led to some of the things we've seen?
One of the things I think we saw in the aftermath of October 7th is that a simplistic oppressor-oppressed dichotomy through means of which people interpret almost every phenomenon in the political world has just become adopted by a very large number of people on campus. And in my view, it leads them to profoundly misjudge what's happening in Israel at present and many other phenomena about the shape of, about modern political contests. Not to say there's nothing to those sorts of arguments, but they vastly oversimplify what is at work in the political world, and often cause us to miss the decisive importance of some really good things, like, in my view, the existence of the State of Israel. And so it is, those things have made such headway on campus, I think in part because there's just not much as an alternative. I don't think a lot of richer moral and political frameworks are commonly available on a lot of our college and university campuses, and nature abhors a vacuum. Something is going to fill that gap, and I think these kinds of the kinds of morally strident political talk that we find so much of on campus, that's what's going on there, is that it's a simple way of looking at the political world that is filling in for the absence of richer and more complex ways of looking at that world.
So we're running out of time, so I want to ask you our classic Buckley Institute question. We are named after William F. Buckley Jr., so we ask all of our guests about what impact, if any, Buckley has had in their life, whether it's just watching Firing Line, reading National Review. So what interaction with Buckley, indirect, direct, have you had?
I wasn't a conservative when I was growing up. I had no idea what I thought about politics, and insofar as I did think anything about this, I would have been on the left. But nonetheless, Buckley there was a figure there that I knew there was something admirable about, and so he had that role. God and Men at Yale in some ways gave rise to modern American conservatism. It is in some ways, one of the most important origin points for the whole thing. And so, in that sense, like Buckley and Buckley's arguments about what's going on campus have been deeply formative for me in my entire intellectual and political life. And so I'm grateful to him for that.
Well, Dr. Storey, thanks so much for joining us for the Lux at Veritas Leadership Program, and thanks for joining us for Pod and Man at Yale.
Thanks so much for having me on the most amusingly named podcast I've ever visited.
Thanks. I appreciate the compliment. That wraps up another great episode of Pod and Man at Yale. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. And always remember, for God, for country, for Yale, in that order.